In 1892, leaders of the Farmers' Alliance founded a new political party, known as the People's Party or Populist Party, to pursue their goals. They nominated James B. Weaver in 1892 as their presidential candidate. The Populist Party would replace the Farmers' Alliance, which faded away. While they tried to incorporate other groups, the Populists remained almost entirely focused on issues for the farmer. They demanded an increase in the circulated currency through the unlimited coinage of silver, a graduated income tax, government ownership of railroads, the direct election of U.S. senators, and other measures intended to increase participatory democracy. Additional platform ideas included the Australian ballot, which is the secret ballot, the initiative, which allowed people to write their own bills, a referendum, which is a vote by the people on an initiative, recall, allowing citizens to call for a special election to vote to remove them from office. Populists saw the railroads as a public good, therefore should be owned and regulated by the public. They also wanted term limits. The Coinage Act of 1873 officially ended bimetallism and put the nation firmly on the gold standard. The main focus of the bill was to revise laws related to the structure and procedures of the U.S. Mint, the agency that prints our currency. It was also passed to help standardize currency across international borders. The law states that the U.S. Mint can no longer produce silver dollars as legal tender in the future. Until 1873, the U.S. had used a system known as bimetallism, which used both gold and silver as legal tender, and set a fixed exchange rate between the two. The Coinage Act removed silver, and people who owned large amounts of silver were no longer able to turn that silver into money. Critics argued that the gold standard would lead to unstable prices and a lower amount of money in circulation. This never happened, largely thanks to advances in industry and the subsequent gold rushes, like the Klondike Gold Rush. Unfortunately, this greatly impacted miners and farmers, who had heavy debts to pay. This law was so famous that it was known as the Crime of 73. As the debate over access to capital increased, the debate turned to the nation's monetary system. The question became, should the nation's cash be backed by gold or by gold and silver? The system in which money backed by gold and silver is known as bimetallism. Supporters of the Populist Party platform supported the free and unlimited coinage of silver, which would expand the money supply and expand access to federal loans to ease the financial burdens on farmers and small businesses. Supporters of free silver believed that an expanded currency would increase the price of their crops, and debtors hoped it would enable them to pay their debts more easily. Silver became the symbol of economic justice for the American people. The collapse of land and farm prices in 1887 pushed farmers to demand the federal government do something about the monetary system. In 1890, Congress enacted the Sherman Silver Purchase Act, which increased the government's monthly silver purchases by 50%. Unfortunately, it was repealed at the onset of the Panic of 1893, prompting the Populists to continue their push for bimetallism. A growing depression in Europe led British investors to sell off their American investments in favor of gold. This led to a shrinking of the American gold supply, creating a panic. Bank runs resulted from this gold shortage, contributing to over 500 bank closures. In the spring and summer of 1893, the stock market crashed as a result of overspeculation, and dozens of railroads went into bankruptcy as a result of overbuilding. The depression continued for almost 4 years. Farm foreclosures reached new highs, and the unemployment reached 20% of the workforce. President Cleveland, far more conservative than he had been in the 1880s, dealt with the crisis by repealing the Sherman Silver Purchase Act, championing the gold standard, and otherwise adopting a hands-off policy towards the economy. As a result of the panic, President Cleveland was forced to borrow $65 million in gold from J.P. Morgan. National politics was in transition. President Cleveland's handling of the Depression thoroughly discredited the conservative leadership of the Democratic Party, allowing the Republicans to dominate the congressional elections of 1894, as well as the Populists' continued gain of both votes and legislative seats. In the midst of the Depression, a group of unemployed Americans marched on Washington, D.C., led by Jacob Coxey, a businessman. The group of about 100 men marched from Ohio to the nation's capital to persuade Congress to authorize a large public road building program, increasing the money supply and jobs for the unemployed. His march did get quite a bit of publicity, but ended suddenly when Coxey and some of his followers were arrested for trying to speak from the Capitol steps and jailed for trespassing on the lawns of the Capitol building. William McKinley won the Republican Party's nomination for president, beating out former President Benjamin Harrison, who had been defeated by Grover Cleveland in the previous election. McKinley was a protectionist in favor of a strong tariff to protect American businesses. He also opposed the free coinage of silver in favor of keeping the gold standard, which had been in place since 1873. His political manager, Mark Hanna, organized a front porch campaign, where McKinley spoke to over 700,000 supporters, all in front of his house in Ohio. Hanna would also take advantage of mass media to push McKinley's candidacy to the public. Hanna, meanwhile, did most of the work of campaigning. He raised millions of dollars for the Republican ticket from business leaders who feared that silver lunacy would lead to runaway inflation. Hanna used the money to sell McKinley through the mass media, while the Republican candidate stayed home. William Jennings Bryan won the Democratic Party's nomination for president after his electrifying Cross of Gold speech, in which he evoked the imagery of the crucifixion of Christ and a comparison to the gold standard. A former lawyer from Illinois, Bryan served in the House of Representatives since 1890. Bryan and many Democrats believed the Panic of 1893 could be solved with bimetallism, or the coinage of silver. The Populist Party, who had been unsuccessful in winning the presidency, endorsed Bryan for president. Gold-supporting Democrats abandoned Bryan and supported his Republican opponent. Bryan's campaign focused on silver and went on an extensive whistle-stop tour of the nation, speaking over 600 times to an estimated 5 million listeners. William McKinley will win the election of 1896 over William Jennings Bryan by securing 271 electoral votes and winning the popular vote 51% to 47%. In the last weeks of the campaign, Bryan was hurt by a sudden rise in the wheat prices, which made farmers less desperate. Factory owners across the country warned their workers that voting for Bryan would lead to factory shutdowns. As you can see on the election map on the right, McKinley carried the Northeast and the Midwest, areas of heavy industry and larger populations. Bryan won the South and the West, areas dominated by agriculture. McKinley won for a variety of reasons. First, he campaigned on big issues, the tariff and sound money. He went after Bryan and free silver, arguing that it would hurt the working class American the most. He also reached out to immigrants and urban factory workers, recognizing their importance. McKinley was supported by middle-class and wealthy voters, urban laborers, and prosperous farmers. Voter turnout in this election was about 80%, which was typical of elections in the 19th century. Looking at the map on the left, you will notice the results of the elections of 1888, won by Harrison, 1892, won by Cleveland, and 1896, won by McKinley. Notice that the Populists only have a national candidate in 1892 and only won a few states in the West. In 1896, Democrats gained support in the West because of Bryan's populist views, but lost support in the East, where they had been successful 4 years earlier. The election of 1896 marked a fundamental shift in American politics and the emergence of a new political reality that reflected the major changes in the nation. It began an era of Republican dominance, with 7 of the next 9 presidents being members of the GOP. It also began a period of economic prosperity that would last for nearly 4 decades. It also marked the end of the Populist Party, which didn't dissolve but would never again appear on the national stage. Most importantly, the 1896 election marked the decisive triumph of the nation's urban interests, banking, manufacturing, industry, over agricultural ones. The Republican Party becomes the party of big business and a strong national government. With Americans migrating to cities at a rapidly increasing rate, no future candidate can hope to win by only appealing to the country's rural population. The Republicans also abandoned African Americans by refusing to address the discrimination and lynching that's taking place in the Deep South.